It was a rainy night. The kind of night that makes everything seem a bit more ominous. The windshield wipers of my old taxi struggled to keep up with the deluge, squeaking with each pass. I had been driving for hours, my shift dragging on. The rain hammering on the roof of my cab, adding to my weariness. I was just about ready to call it a night when I saw her standing under a flickering street lamp, drenched to the bone, her hair plastered to her face. I almost didn't stop. After all, it was late, and I was tired. But something about her compelled me to pull over. She stepped into the light, and my breath caught in my throat. She looked exactly like Emily, my daughter who had died in a car accident 5 years ago. It was impossible, of course, but there she was, a ghost from my past standing in the rain. She opened the door and slid into the back seat, her eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. They were the same shade of blue, the same piercing intensity. My heart raced, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Where to?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Home," she replied, her voice eerily calm. "Take me home, Dad." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't been called Dad in years, not since Emily died. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady my hands. "Do I know you?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't answer, just looked out the window at the rain-soaked streets. There was something familiar in the way she held herself, the way she looked out at the world with a sense of detachment. It was Emily, and yet it wasn't. I started driving, my mind racing. Could this really be my daughter? Had she somehow survived and come back to me? But no, that was impossible. I had identified her body at the morgue. I had buried her. This had to be some kind of cruel joke. As we drove, the rain seemed to intensify, the streets becoming rivers of water. The city around us took on a dreamlike quality, buildings and lights blurring together. The girl in the back seat remained silent, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Then she spoke, her voice breaking the silence like a knife. "You're in danger, Dad. You have to listen to me." I glanced at her in the mirror, my heart pounding. "What do you mean? What kind of danger?" She leaned forward, her face inches from the glass partition that separated us. "You have to figure it out. The clues are there, but you need to see them. If you don't, it'll be too late." "Clues? What clues?" I asked, confusion and fear mingling in my mind. "Think, Dad. Think about the past, about what happened. The accident wasn't an accident. You have to remember." My mind was a whirlwind of memories and emotions. The accident. That night 5 years ago. The car coming out of nowhere. The screech of tires. The crunch of metal. And then the darkness. But what was she saying? That it wasn't an accident? I pulled the taxi to a stop at a red light, turning to look at her. "Emily, I don't understand. What do you mean it wasn't an accident?" But she was gone. The back seat was empty, the door slightly ajar, rain blowing in. I got out of the car, looking up and down the street, but there was no sign of her. She had vanished into the night, as mysteriously as she had appeared. I stood there in the rain, my mind racing. What had just happened? Had I imagined it all? But no, the seat was wet where she had been sitting. She was real. Or had been. I got back into the cab, my mind a mess of thoughts and memories. I drove aimlessly for a while, trying to make sense of it all. What had she meant? What clues was she talking about? Then it hit me. The accident. I had always accepted it as a tragic event, something that had happened to us, but what if there was more to it? What if it hadn't been an accident at all? I drove to the site of the crash, the place where my world had fallen apart. The rain had stopped, and the streets were eerily quiet. I stood there, staring at the spot where it had all happened. And then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the shadows. It was her. Emily. She stood there watching me, her eyes filled with sadness. "Emily!" I called out, my voice breaking. "What do you want me to do?" She pointed to the ground, to a patch of earth that seemed undisturbed. I walked over, my heart pounding, and started to dig with my hands. The ground was soft from the rain, and soon I uncovered a small metal box. Inside the box was a stack of letters, old and worn. I pulled them out, my hands shaking. They were addressed to me, from Emily. Letters she had written before she died. Letters I had never seen. I read them, my heart breaking with each word. She had known something dangerous. She had been trying to warn me, but she had died before she could tell me everything. The last letter was the most chilling. She had written about a man, someone who had been following her, threatening her. She had been scared, and she had been trying to protect me, but she had failed. I sat there in the rain, the truth dawning on me. The accident hadn't been an accident. It had been a murder. Someone had killed my daughter, and they were still out there. I got back into the cab, my mind made up. I had to find this man, had to stop him before he could hurt anyone else. Emily had given me the clues, and now it was up to me to put them together. As I drove through the night, I felt her presence beside me, guiding me. I would find the man who had done this, and I would make him pay. For Emily. For my daughter. The rain started again, a steady downpour that mirrored the tears streaming down my face. But I didn't care. I had a mission now, a purpose, and I wouldn't stop until I had justice for my daughter. The city passed by in a blur, the lights and shadows merging into one. But I didn't notice. All I could see was Emily's face, her eyes pleading with me to find the truth. And I would, no matter what it took. I would find the man who had taken her from me, and I would make sure he never hurt anyone again. As I drove through the dark, rainy streets, I felt a strange sense of calm. Emily was with me, guiding me, and together, we would find the truth. I've been driving taxis for over 15 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. Drunks, late-night philosophers, lovers having quarrels, the occasional celebrity. Nothing really surprised me anymore. But that night, it changed everything. It was a chilly autumn evening, and the streets were unusually quiet. I picked up my first passenger around 8, a middle-aged woman clutching a shopping bag like it was a lifeline. She seemed nervous, glancing around as if expecting someone, or something, to jump out at her. "Good evening, ma'am. Where to?" I asked, trying to sound cheerful. She barely looked at me, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "Just drive. I'll tell you where to go," she whispered. I shrugged and pulled away from the curb, keeping an eye on her in the mirror. She kept shifting in her seat, glancing at the dark corners of the cab. After a few minutes, she let out a gasp. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "See what, ma'am?" "The shadow. It moved." I looked in the mirror again. There was nothing there. Just the usual play of streetlights and darkness. "I think it's just the lights, ma'am." She shook her head violently. No, it's not the lights. It's them. They're here." I felt a chill run down my spine. Something in her voice, the raw fear, made me uneasy. "Who's them?" "The shadows," she whispered. They whisper. They feed off our fear. I was about to reassure her when the cab suddenly felt colder. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper, like a sigh carried on the wind. Please, hurry, the woman urged, her eyes wide with terror. I pressed down on the gas, eager to drop her off and shake the eerie feeling that was creeping over me. We reached her destination, a rundown apartment building in a bad part of town. She practically threw money at me and bolted out of the cab without a word. I tried to shake off the encounter and told myself she was just another crazy person. But as the night wore on, it became harder to believe that. My next passenger was a young man, probably in his 20s. He jumped into the cab, looking over his shoulder. Drive, just drive, he ordered, his voice barely a notch above a whisper. Where to? I asked, already dreading the answer. Just away from here, he said, his eyes glued to the back seat. I started driving, and after a few minutes he let out a strangled cry. Did you hear that? I didn't need to ask what he meant. The whispering was louder now, almost like a chorus of voices just on the edge of hearing. I think there's something wrong with your cab, he said, his voice shaking. I think you're right, I muttered, my hands gripping the wheel tighter. The young man kept looking around, his face pale. They're here too, he whispered. They're always here. We drove in silence for a while, the whispering growing louder. I felt a cold draft brush against my neck, and the shadows in the cab seemed to twist and writhe. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. A shadow, darker than the others, seemed to move on its own. It stretched out towards the young man, who was now trembling in his seat. Get out, I said suddenly, pulling over. What? He asked, confused. Get out of the cab, now! He didn't need to be told twice. He jumped out and ran down the street, disappearing into the night. I sat there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what was happening. The whispering faded, and the shadows returned to normal. I wanted to call it a night, but something compelled me to keep driving. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the lingering chill of those whispers. Whatever it was, I kept going. My next fare was an elderly man. He was calm, almost serene, as he got into the cab. Good evening, he said with a smile. Evening, I replied, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. Do you believe in ghosts? He asked suddenly, catching me off guard. I don't know, I admitted. I'm starting to. He nodded, as if he understood. There are things in this world we cannot see, things that exist in the shadows. I shivered involuntarily. What do they want? He looked at me, his eyes piercing. They want to be acknowledged. They feed on our fear because it makes them feel real. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those shadows again. How do we stop them? He smiled sadly. You can't stop them. You can only hope to avoid them. We drove in silence for a while, the whispering starting up again. The old man didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't show it. When we reached his destination, he handed me a crisp bill and got out. Good luck, he said, his voice barely audible over the whispers. As he walked away, I felt a sudden urge to follow him, to ask him more about the shadows, but something held me back. I watched him disappear into the night, and then I drove away. The rest of the night was a blur of faces and voices, all tinged with fear. Each passenger seemed to sense the shadows, their terror feeding the whispering chorus. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed. I parked the cab and sat there, trying to process everything. The shadows, the whispers, the fear. It all seemed like a bad dream, but I knew it was real. I could still hear the faint whispers, like an echo in my mind. As the sun rose, the shadows retreated, and the whispering faded. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the cab, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin. I hoped that daylight would bring some clarity, some relief, but even as I walked away, I knew that the shadows would return. They were always there, lurking on the edge of perception, waiting for the night. And as much as I wanted to believe otherwise, I knew that I would hear their whispers again. The only question was, how long could I ignore them before they consumed me completely? I had just finished a long day at work and needed to get home. The city lights were starting to blur as my fatigue set in. I flagged down the first taxi I saw. It screeched to a halt beside me, and I got in without a second thought. The driver, a gaunt man with sunken eyes and an eerie silence, handed me a small notepad and a pen. I assumed he was mute, so I wrote down my address and handed it back to him. He nodded, his eyes briefly meeting mine in the rearview mirror, sending a shiver down my spine. As we pulled away from the curb, I settled back into the worn seat, hoping to catch a brief nap. The cityscape outside the window seemed to melt away, replaced by unfamiliar streets and looming shadows. It wasn't long before I noticed something odd. The route we were taking was unfamiliar, even for a city as sprawling and chaotic as this one. I leaned forward, intending to ask the driver if he knew where he was going, but the words caught in my throat. The driver's eyes in the mirror were no longer just eerie. They were hollow, dark pits, staring straight through me. I shook off the feeling and tapped him on the shoulder, motioning for the notepad again. He handed it back without a word, his hands cold and clammy against mine. I scribbled, "Is this the right way?" and handed it back. He read it, glanced at me with those unnerving eyes, and nodded slowly. He didn't return the notepad. Instead, he handed me a piece of paper that seemed much older, yellowed and frayed at the edges. On it, scrawled in an almost illegible script, were the words, "Trust the ride." An icy dread coiled in my stomach. Trust the ride. What was that supposed to mean? I watched the city lights fade into darkness as the buildings grew sparser and more decrepit. We were definitely not heading toward my neighborhood. Panic began to set in. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The battery, which had been full just minutes ago, was now inexplicably drained. I tried to open the door, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was as if it were welded shut. My breathing quickened as I pounded on the window, shouting for help. The driver's gaze remained fixed on the road, unwavering. In desperation, I grabbed the notepad again and wrote, "Let me out!" I shoved it toward him, but he didn't even glance at it. Instead, he handed me another yellowed note. Leaving is not an option. I felt trapped, like a caged animal. The taxi moved steadily forward, carrying me deeper into the abyss. I started to notice the temperature dropping, my breath visible in the dim light of the dashboard. I could see my own fear reflected in the rearview mirror, mingling with the driver's haunting eyes. The city had completely vanished, replaced by a desolate landscape of twisted trees and fog. The only light came from the taxi's dim headlights, barely piercing the thick darkness. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the engine and my ragged breathing. Then, the car stopped. Not at a destination, but in the middle of nowhere. The driver turned around fully for the first time, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. He handed me one last note. Welcome to your final stop. My blood ran cold. I looked around frantically, trying to find any sign of civilization. But there was nothing. Just endless darkness. I knew I had to get out. Consequences be damned. I lunged at the door with all my strength, kicking and pounding until the glass finally shattered. I crawled through the broken window, cutting myself on the jagged edges. But I didn't care. I just needed to escape. As soon as my feet hit the ground, I started running. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get as far away from that taxi as possible. The driver didn't follow. He simply sat there, watching me with those dead eyes. The fog seemed to close in around me, and I could hear whispers, low and unintelligible, growing louder with every step. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled through the darkness, the whispers now forming coherent words. You can't escape. You belong here. I tripped and fell, my hands sinking into the cold, damp earth. When I looked up, I saw them. Figures emerging from the fog, pale and ghostly, their faces contorted in silent screams. They reached out to me with skeletal hands, their touch freezing my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My voice was gone, stolen by the oppressive silence. The figures closed in, their hollow eyes filled with the same darkness as the driver's. I fought to break free, but their grip was too strong. The whispers grew louder, filling my mind with a relentless chant. Join us. Join us. Just as I felt myself being pulled into the void, a blinding light pierced the darkness. The figures recoiled, hissing and retreating into the fog. I was suddenly back in the taxi, my heart racing and my body drenched in sweat. The driver was gone, and the door was open. I stumbled out onto the street, finding myself in front of my apartment building. The city was alive around me, bustling with noise and light. It was as if nothing had happened. Yet I knew I had been to a place beyond comprehension. I never saw that taxi again, but I kept the old notes as a grim reminder. Every so often I'd wake in the middle of the night, the whispers echoing in my mind. Trust the ride. Leaving is not an option. Now, every time I see a taxi, I feel a pang of fear. I know that somewhere out there, a silent driver waits, his hollow eyes searching for his next passenger. And I know that once you take that ride, you can never truly escape.